War doesn't just end when the battles do. Some wars live on, not in the history books, but in the minds of those who fought them. There are no victors in war, only survivors, and some of them are never the same. And sometimes, it isn't just the scars of battle that remain. Sometimes something follows them back, something that cannot be seen but always felt. Some soldiers returned home believing they were cursed by the very wars they fought in. The line between madness and reality began to blur, as if the war itself had marked them, not with blood, but with a dark, unexplainable fate. We are all familiar with the physical toll that war exacts: broken bones, missing limbs, and scars that tell stories. But there are other wounds, less visible and far more treacherous. Some soldiers came back haunted by memories, but for others, it was as if the war itself had infected their very souls, leaving behind not just trauma, but a deep-rooted belief in something darker. A curse, perhaps. They didn't just suffer from PTSD. No, this was something far beyond psychological strain. These were men who looked into the abyss of battle and saw something staring back, something that was not of this world. They couldn't explain it, but it was there, and for some, it never left. Some returned home and tried to live as if nothing had happened, but no matter how far they traveled, something clung to them. A whisper in the dark, a shadow at the corner of their eye, a dream that felt all too real. They weren't just soldiers anymore. They had become something else, cursed, forever tied to the blood-soaked earth they left behind. War has always been a place of unimaginable horrors, but for some soldiers, the horror didn't end when the guns fell silent. What if the real terror wasn't the enemies they fought, but the very idea that they were marked by war itself? That surviving had come at a price too high to pay. Throughout history, there have been countless soldiers who returned home with their minds shattered. They weren't the same men who left. Some believed their survival was the beginning of something more, something cursed. This documentary will take you through the stories of soldiers from ancient times to modern-day conflicts who came to believe that the war had marked them in ways they couldn't comprehend. From the soldiers of ancient Rome to the trench fighters of the First World War and the battlefields of Vietnam, soldiers have carried with them not just the memories of war, but something much darker. A curse, not of their own making, but one they were forced to bear. They thought they could escape, but the war never let them go. They believed they were cursed by the very blood they spilled. In the coming chapters, we will explore these men who fought wars and returned with a curse they couldn't shake. It is said that the gods watch over men in battle, but they also hold the power to punish those who tread too deeply into the violence of war. In the ancient world, warriors were not just soldiers. They were pawns in a game far greater than they could ever understand. Their lives, their fates, were intertwined with the divine, and the wrath of the gods was a force far more powerful than any enemy they faced. In times long before we understood the true cost of war, men believed they could bargain with the gods. If they fought with honor, the gods would grant them victory. But should they betray their sacred vows, should they survive too many battles, their actions would not be forgotten. No, the gods would punish them, and the curses they carried were said to be eternal. Among these ancient beliefs, the Greek warriors were among the most devout. As they prepared for battle, their minds were not solely focused on the enemy they could see. No, their minds were haunted by the gods they could not see. Before stepping into the fray, they would visit oracles or priests seeking divine favor. A blessing, perhaps, protection from the wrath of Ares, the god of war himself. For Ares was a capricious deity, known not just for his thirst for blood, but for the madness he could instill in those who survived too long in battle. The Greek soldiers knew well the consequences of angering the gods. Those who fought too fiercely, too brutally, or who survived battle after battle without honor would risk the wrath of Ares himself. The god's anger was not limited to mere death. No, it was far more insidious. Some believed that Ares had the power to drive warriors mad, to twist their minds and make them question everything they knew. And for those who were cursed, there was no escape. Their fate would be sealed by their own hands. It wasn't just Greek warriors who believed in the gods' power to curse them. The Romans, with their vast empire, also saw the divine as a constant presence on the battlefield. One particular legion, the Legio IX Hispana, would become a tragic example of how far a curse could stretch. In 117 AD, this Roman legion, one of the most fearsome in the empire, vanished without a trace in Britain. No one knew what happened to them. Were they overrun by their enemies? Was it the land itself that swallowed them whole? Or did they disappear because the gods had finally claimed their due? There were whispers, even then, that the Legio IX Hispana had been cursed by the gods for their brutal conquests. Their victories were many, but so too were their acts of violence. Some say they were punished for their ruthlessness, for the blood they spilled without remorse. The soldiers who disappeared were believed to have angered the gods, and in return, they were erased from history, never to be seen again. The disappearance of the Legio IX Hispana left a mark on history. And yet, perhaps the most unsettling aspect was not the physical disappearance of the soldiers, but the belief that they had been erased by the gods. To the people of the time, this wasn't just a tragic loss, it was a warning that no one could outrun their fate, not even the mighty Roman legions. For those who lived through the ancient wars, the idea of divine retribution was not just superstition, it was reality. The fear that the gods could curse a soldier for surviving too many battles or for taking part in actions that crossed some invisible line was real. To these warriors, death wasn't just an end, it was a release from a curse that could only be broken by the gods themselves. But even as these ancient warriors believed in the power of curses, the question remains, did they truly believe in these supernatural forces, or were they simply victims of the trauma of war? Were the gods punishing them, or was it their own minds, twisted by violence and fear, that created these haunting beliefs? Centuries have passed since those ancient battles, but the fear, the belief in curses, has never truly faded. Soldiers today may not invoke the gods before battle, but the idea of being cursed by war, by its violence, its carnage, still lingers. Perhaps it is an echo of the past. Perhaps it is something much darker, something that has followed humanity through every conflict since the dawn of time. As we move forward in time, the curse of war may not always be seen in the form of gods, but it remains in some form, alive and well. The soldiers of the past believed in divine punishment, but in the end, perhaps it is the soldiers themselves who must answer for the blood they spill, if not on the battlefield, then in their minds, in their dreams, in the darkness they carry with them. Imagine, if you will, the stench of death and decay in the air, the constant bombardment echoing in your ears, and the relentless fear that clings to your skin like mud. This was the reality of soldiers in the trenches of World War I. They didn't just fight their enemies, they fought an environment that seemed determined to break them, body and soul. For many of them, war became more than just a series of battles. It became a curse they could never escape. In the battlefields of the Western Front, where the earth itself seemed to rot under the weight of death, soldiers believed they were cursed not just by the enemy, but by the very land they fought upon. For many, it wasn't the bullets or shells that claimed their lives, but something far more insidious. Poison gas, the grotesque sickness of trench foot, and the eternal roar of explosions that rattled their very souls. Among the many battalions that fought in those hellish trenches, there was one that stood out, the accursed battalion of the Somme. It wasn't just the relentless fighting that left its mark on these men, but the inexplicable illnesses, the deaths that seemed to come out of nowhere. Men who returned home, only to find that death still had a grip on them. There was talk that they had been marked, doomed by the horrors they had witnessed. Some even believed that the battalion had been cursed, doomed to never leave the battlefield in spirit. One survivor, a man whose name has been lost to history, spoke often of his time in the trenches. He claimed that every time death came for him, it passed him by, almost as if he had been spared. But with that spared life came a torment unlike any other. He spoke of horrific visions, of the faces of fallen comrades who had died beside him, their eyes accusing him of being the one who survived while they perished. He believed that the war had cursed him, and no matter how far he ran, the ghosts of the fallen would follow him. The curse of survival did not end with the Great War. No, it would haunt the soldiers of the Second World War with an even greater ferocity. But now, there was something else at play. The horrors of combat had evolved. Now, it wasn't just the physical dangers that threatened to consume the soul, it was the psychological devastation that followed. What was once known as shell shock, now understood as post-traumatic stress disorder, was experienced by many soldiers in the hellish theaters of World War II. For these men, war didn't just steal their lives during the battle. It followed them home like an uninvited shadow. One such man, Private Tompkins of the British Army, survived the ferocious Battle of Dunkirk. But when he returned home, it became clear that survival had come with a price. Private Tompkins found himself plagued by unexplainable occurrences. His uniform, though washed clean, would inexplicably stain with blood, as though the memories of the battlefield were bleeding through into his present. Even more terrifying, he began hearing voices of soldiers begging for help, pleading with him from the beyond. The line between reality and nightmare blurred for him, and he came to believe that his survival wasn't a gift. No, it was a curse that marked him as the chosen survivor, the one who carried the spirits of the fallen. But it wasn't just Tompkins who believed he was marked by the dead. Many soldiers from both world wars carried a heavy weight after returning home. It wasn't just the horrors of combat that tore at them, it was the unbearable guilt of survival, the curse of knowing that, while their comrades lay dead, they had lived. Survivor's guilt is a wound that cuts deeper than any physical injury. It is a torment that makes life itself seem like a punishment. For some, the burden of survival was too much to bear. Men abandoned their families, destroyed their possessions, or even took their own lives, convinced that the curse of survival would never let them rest. They believed that by living, they had been marked, chosen by some unseen hand to endure a fate worse than death. And in their minds, the only way to escape this curse was to end their own suffering. The curse of survival, of knowing that you were spared only to be haunted by the faces of those who did not return, remains one of the most devastating consequences of war. For these men, there was no peace, no release, only the weight of memory, the unshakable belief that they had been marked by the war and that no matter how far they ran, they would never escape its grip. It's a strange thing, isn't it? We often think of war in terms of weapons, tanks, bombs, rifles, but there's something else that wars leave behind, something unseen, something that can't be captured by cameras or radar. It lingers in the air long after the last shot is fired, long after the final casualty is counted. The Vietnam War was a perfect storm of such a curse, a battle that not only left scars on the land, but on the minds of the men who fought it. The jungles of Vietnam were a nightmare of both flesh and mind. Guerrilla warfare was the true enemy, a silent, invisible foe that attacked from the shadows. The constant fear of booby traps, ambushes, and unseen snipers left soldiers in a perpetual state of tension. But it wasn't just the human enemy that haunted them. Some of them began to speak of something else, something they could never quite define, something that crept into their minds like a silent disease, a curse, perhaps, one that followed them through the trees and over the hills. For some soldiers, the curse began when they killed the enemy, but not in the traditional sense. No, these were kills that happened without ever seeing the face of the man or woman they were fighting. The enemy seemed to vanish into the jungle, like smoke, leaving no trace. They were killed, but not really. The souls of the dead were left to haunt the living, as if every life taken in the jungle took a part of their own humanity. Soldiers began hearing voices, whispers in the dark, telling them they had done something wrong, something that could never be undone. One soldier, whom history has mostly forgotten, came to be known as the man who heard the voices. He spent days, weeks even, wandering the jungle in a dazed state, convinced that the enemy was everywhere. His comrades watched him unravel, day by day, as he grew more paranoid. He couldn't even look at a shadow without seeing the enemy in it. His mind betrayed him, and in his mind the curse had taken root, a presence that he could not escape. He was certain that each battle, each kill, had connected him to something beyond the realm of the living. His every move was watched, his every breath was controlled. Fast forward to the Gulf War, a conflict that would introduce a new kind of battlefield, one where technology and ancient beliefs collided. The desert, stretching endlessly beneath the burning sun, was a hostile environment, but it was nothing compared to the strange occurrences that would haunt the soldiers who fought there. This was a war unlike any other, where the lines between the past and the present, the supernatural and the real, blurred beyond recognition. It was in this ancient desert, where echoes of old battles whispered through the winds, that a strange artifact was discovered. An item, perhaps older than the war itself, its origins unknown, its power unspoken. It was found in the shifting sands, a relic from a time long past. But no one knew then what consequences it would bring. Specialist Bill Simmons, a Gulf War veteran, was one of the few men who touched the artifact. He would later claim that from that moment on, his life was never the same. Accidents, bad luck, strange phenomena, each day seemed to bring something more inexplicable. The soldiers who had been near the artifact began to experience bizarre occurrences. Some of them awoke with bruises, others heard phantom explosions in the dead of night. But perhaps the most unsettling was the feeling of being watched, even in the most remote, isolated places. Simmons would later become convinced that the artifact had cursed him and all those who had come into contact with it. He believed that the spirits of ancient warriors, long dead, had risen from the sands and were now following him. It was as if the desert itself had a life, a dark, malevolent force that sought to claim its own. No matter where Simmons went, no matter how far he ran, the curse seemed to follow, leaving him with a life marked by misfortune and death. Some curses are not born of magic or superstition. They are born of the land itself, the trauma left behind by the violence of war. The men who fought in Vietnam, the men who fought in the Gulf, they carry more than just memories of battle. They carry the curse of war itself, a curse that does not end with the signing of a peace treaty or the return to home soil. No, for them, the war is never truly over. It follows them in every shadow, in every whisper of the wind, reminding them that some battles are fought not with weapons, but with the mind. It begins with a whisper, a single thought that slips into the mind of a soldier, unnoticed at first, but once it's planted, it festers, it grows, and soon it becomes a belief so powerful it begins to shape reality, the curse. They start to think they are haunted by something they cannot escape, something beyond the scope of war. And then it's too late, because once the belief takes root, it spirals down, deeper and deeper into madness. At first, it's subtle. A soldier might hear a voice in the wind or feel the hair on the back of his neck stand up when no one else is around. It's an uneasiness, something that can be ignored at first, but soon it becomes overwhelming. The belief starts to take on a life of its own. Every flash of light, every shadow in the corner of the eye, every unexplained sound becomes another confirmation that they are, in fact, cursed. Their mind begins to erode, piece by piece, and what they once called reality begins to fragment into something unrecognizable. For some, it becomes too much to bear. The belief that they are cursed transforms into an obsession. Their lives become consumed by the idea that they are marked by something beyond the grasp of understanding. They start to isolate themselves, pushing away loved ones, friends, anyone who might help. They can't escape the idea that they are cursed. They begin to lash out in anger, their behavior erratic, and in some cases violent. What started as a simple feeling, a lingering suspicion, morphs into something that defines them. It's not just a belief anymore, it's their reality. And then they come home. After the battles, the bloodshed, the whispers in the jungle or the desert, they return to what they once knew. But nothing is the same. The war doesn't leave them behind. It follows them like a shadow that no amount of light can dispel. Some try to resume their lives, returning to families or jobs they once had. But it doesn't work. The curse has already taken root, and the world they come back to doesn't fit. Everything feels off. Their minds, fractured by the war, begin to break even further. The weight of the curse becomes too heavy to carry. Some become reclusive, avoiding the outside world altogether. Others lash out at those closest to them. The violence they once saw on the battlefield now emerges in their homes, in their relationships. It's a pain they can't communicate, because how do you explain that you are haunted by something no one else can see? The curse, they believe, is irreversible. It wasn't just the physical wounds that marked them, but the psychological scars. And no matter how hard they try, they cannot escape it. And yet, there are those who believe they can break the curse. The world has changed. Wars have changed, technology has advanced, but the psychological scars remain. In recent conflicts like those in Afghanistan or Iraq, soldiers still speak of feeling haunted by their experiences. But now, it's different. Now there are treatments, therapies, methods to help, methods that promise to heal. And yet, for some, these modern solutions seem like nothing more than a bandage. They believe the curse cannot be fixed with words or medicine. It's a part of them now, woven into their very soul. Some soldiers never accept that the curse is something that can be undone. They walk through life with their heads held low, their eyes constantly searching for the ghosts of the past. They question their survival, convinced that they were spared for a reason. But the truth is, there are no answers, only more questions. The curse, whatever it may be, will never truly let them go. As the dust of war settles and the battlefields grow quiet, there are those who cannot find peace. They return home, not as they once were, but as something different. They carry with them more than just memories. They carry the weight of something far harder to grasp. A burden that can't be seen but is felt in every waking moment. But is it real? Or is it a shadow of the mind, a creation of the horrors they endured, forever etched into their psyche? The question lingers, are these soldiers truly cursed, or have they simply become victims of their own minds, prisoners to the trauma they've witnessed? Is it possible that the war, though over, never truly ends for them? And for those who return home, who try to pick up the pieces of a life shattered, does the curse follow them, or is it simply the aftermath of something that has left a permanent mark on their soul? For some, the war may end, but its grip never truly loosens. The battles they fought are not forgotten, and neither are the spirits of the fallen. They carry the past with them, whether they want to or not. But does this mean they are cursed, or is it simply a deep and unhealed wound that the passage of time has not been able to close? And what of the other side of the war? The civilians, the families, the innocent bystanders who were caught in the chaos. What psychological toll do they carry? Perhaps it's not just the soldiers who are affected by the conflict. Perhaps war, in its own way, curses everyone it touches. We could explore these questions further. In the end, we must ask ourselves, when does the war truly end, and when does the curse finally fade? So, we are left with this haunting question. If the battlefields are empty, does the curse ever truly end? Or is the war simply waiting to claim new victims, even when no weapons are fired? It is a question that may never have an answer, but one thing is certain. For some, the battle continues long after the last shot is fired, long after the last flag is lowered. Thank you for joining us. If you've ever wondered whether the impact of war is truly ever over, perhaps you now have a glimpse into the enduring, invisible costs soldiers and civilians alike bear. In the next episode, we'll take a closer look at how modern warfare affects not just the soldiers on the front lines, but the families and communities left behind. Until then, remember, the battles we fight may not always be fought with weapons.